Happy Mother's Day to all the moms who are with us today. Today is definitely a day to celebrate. I do always like to say, though, it can be a tough day for some of us. Many of us, our moms and our grandmas, have passed on. Some people may not have a good relationship with their mom. Others may have wanted to have children but never did for whatever reason in their lives. And so Mother's Day is a day to celebrate, but it can also be kind of a sad day for some of us. My mom passed away in 2010, so it's been a lot of years now. But the first Mother's Day after my mom died in 2011 was on my birthday, and it was my 30th birthday. So I'm 45 now, so looking back, it's like, man, 30? What was I complaining about then? But when you're 29 and going to 30, that's just awful. It was terrible. So it was really a triple whammy back in 2011 for me. It was Mother's Day, my birthday, and my 30th birthday. But anyway, Mother's Day is a day to celebrate. I do encourage you guys, if you can, celebrate. Remember, some of us that might not be having the best days, but treat mom to lunch, not McDonald's. Unless mom really, really needs a fish sandwich, then go over there. I was thinking, as I was writing some of this stuff, I was thinking about my grandparents. And they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary back in 2000, 2002, 2004, somewhere in there. And so the kids and the grandkids and all of us, we wanted to do something really nice for them. It's their 50th wedding anniversary. That's something to celebrate. Anybody here reach 50? Look at this, how many people we got at 50 in here with wedding anniversaries. That's not 50 years old, 50 years as a wedding. Okay, that's a little different, right? So 50 years in your marriage, congratulations. So we wanted to do something special for my grandparents. We wanted to take them out, maybe a decent steak restaurant or something nice. They wanted to go to a buffet. And it wasn't even that great of a buffet. It was called the North American Steak Buffet. Now you think, ooh, steak, that sounds great. No, this is buffet steak, guys. This is not. But that's where they wanted to go, right? And it was their party, and so we did it. So if mom really wants to go to McDonald's, take her to McDonald's. And I got to say, I know I don't know a whole lot about life and things, but if you guys need a new washer dryer for the house, not a Mother's Day gift. Anybody make that mistake before? Nobody's going to admit that one. It's yeah, we're not. I'm sorry for throwing you under the bus, buddy. Well, if you guys need to talk, my office is open for you. Or are we past that now? So we're good to go? Okay. Working on 50 years. Let's talk about Jesus. Let's get on with some things today. I really was actually struggling with what to preach on today. We've been going through this series of simple yet complex in the Bible. And it was Friday afternoon. It was already late afternoon on Friday. I was trying to figure out still what today's message ought to be. And so I was thinking, there's a lot of good parables out there to talk about. There's a lot that you can talk about that are the basic message and then dig into them. So I thought maybe I'll do a parable, but I'd look at a parable, I'd look at the Good Samaritan, and I looked at the wise and the foolish builders, I looked at the sower. None of those felt right. And so I got to thinking, today is Mother's Day. So maybe I should do a message on moms. But usually that comes off as cliche and kind of tacky a lot of times to talk about that. So I thought maybe do a story about a mom in the Bible. Well, what better mom to talk about than Jesus' mom, right? We'll talk about Mary a little bit. Now, Mary doesn't feature in many stories of the Bible, at least outside of the birth narrative. But here, she is playing a central role in this story in John 2 with the wedding at Cana. By the way, do you guys know how we know today that the wedding at Cana was a very emotional experience for everyone involved? Even the cake was in tears. The cake was in tears. I don't care if you guys don't like that one. I love that joke. Think whatever you want of me. I will always laugh at that joke. We can edit that out of the stream, right? We're going to just cut that out. That never happened. Stop telling jokes. So we're going to talk about this wedding at Cana. And spoiler alert, by the way, Mary is not the point of this story. Frankly, neither is the wedding, actually. So we're going to talk about this. Let's start by talking about the wedding itself. In the first century, a Jewish wedding is not like what we would do today. Now, today, weddings usually take place over a few days, especially if we include a rehearsal and a rehearsal dinner. You include pictures and ceremony and reception. That usually takes, a couple of days. If you do like bachelorette parties, bridal showers, whatever celebrations you do in advance of that, a few days before. Sometimes if maybe the bride is from one place, the groom is from another, the families will have two separate receptions, one where the wedding took place and one at the home of the other, just so more family and friends can come and celebrate. So it can take a few days for weddings today, but Jewish weddings in the first century, these were events that lasted a good week. And throughout that entire week, it was expected that there would be food and drink for all of the guests. And guests would be coming, they'd be going, new people would show up halfway through the week. This would be a really big show. This would be a really big event. And our story starts off that they ran out of wine. I'm going to recap the story, and then we're going to go back and look at some details. They run out of wine, and this is a really big deal. It is incredibly embarrassing to the host to run out of wine. So Mary, she kind of maybe jabs Jesus in the ribs or something, I'm not really sure, and she tells them that they're out of wine. And Jesus' response in verse 4 is, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." We're going to talk about that "woman, why do you involve me" thing in just a little bit. And mom says, Mom says to the servants, do what Jesus tells you to do. And Jesus says, fill up these big water jars, and then take some out of them again, bring it to the master of the banquet. And they do that, and it's turned into wine. And not just wine, it's really, really good wine. This is the first sign that Jesus performs to show people who he is and what power he has. The main point of this story, of what happens here, is really summed up in verse 11. Verse 11 of John chapter 2. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and the disciples believed in him. So the main thing we need to remember about this story here is what Jesus does, and that what Jesus does, what he does, tells us who he is. What he does tells us who he is. Let's talk about some of the other issues then. Some of the other things, some of the deeper meanings of our wedding at Cana. I want to stick with verse 11 for just a moment, which says, this was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. I'm going to harp on the King James Version of the Bible here for a moment. If you're a King James reader, that's okay, but we got to understand that there's some questionable translations in it. King James actually translates this, where we have signs, they translate it as miracles. Virtually all modern English translations use signs here. The New International Version, which is what I'm reading from, the New Living Translation, which is another very popular translation, the ESV, the CSB, the NRSV, all of these translate that word as signs. So what's the difference? What's the problem calling this a miracle as opposed to calling it a sign? I mean, what Jesus technically did is a miracle here, right? He turns water into wine. I'd say that's definitely a miracle. But a sign is public. A sign tells people something. A sign is a public miracle. A miracle can take place anywhere, but it doesn't necessarily mean anyone sees it except for a few who are involved. Think of a miraculous healing, for example. That's something that could happen anytime, any place. It could be in a home, it could be in a hospital room, it could be as you're driving your car down the highway. It might not be a public event, but it's still a miracle that takes place. But a sign is designed, it is intended to be seen by others. If you remember a few weeks ago, I talked about that idea of how not doing good works for others, refusing to help others, is a sign that you don't know Jesus as your Savior. Remember that? If you don't remember that, go back and watch that sermon from a few weeks ago. And I talked about how a cough is a sign of something else. So just as a cough is a sign that there's something going on in your lungs, a cough itself isn't the problem. It tells you there's another problem. Maybe the person coughing has a cold, or the person coughing has allergies. Probably have a doctor come up and tell me you're way off on that analysis here. But the sign here that Jesus performs is a public miracle that tells people who he is. Long story short, just get rid of your King James version of the Bible. Buy yourself a modern translation. It's just going to make life easier. But what this is this is a sign. This is a public miracle that is telling people who Jesus is. Let's go back to the beginning of the story here. So Jesus' mother, Jesus, and the disciples are invited to a wedding, and they go. At this point, there's probably 5 disciples of Jesus. We're not quite up to the 12 yet, just as kind of a little aside. There's probably about 5 disciples. One of the questions that you might ask is, why were they invited? Well, obviously they had some connection to the couple who were married, but John doesn't give us any more information other than they were invited. So it probably isn't all that important as to why. If it were important, John likely would have told us. Verse 3 says, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Why would Jesus' mom be concerned with this? Well, we can speculate then that Jesus and his mother have a close connection to the host of these festivities. Maybe Mary was even co-hosting the wedding. We read Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. The way you read that, Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had been invited to the wedding. Maybe Mary was there because she was helping to host, and then Jesus and the disciples were invited afterwards? We don't know. And again, if it were really important to the story, John likely would have told us. Now, a big one here that a lot of people get hung up on is verse 4. If you want to put verse 4 back up on the screen for just a moment. This is where Jesus replies, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." To our 21st century ears, this sounds like a very rude statement. Woman, don't you get me involved. Why don't you just shut up and leave me alone? Is that what he's saying here? No, not at all. This is not a rude thing for Jesus to say. This is just a standard way for him to address his mother. Remember, this is even how he addresses her when he's on the cross. John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27 say, when Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." So when Jesus says, "Woman, why do you concern me with this?" He's not being rude. This isn't a rude way for Jesus to address his mother. It'd be like us going to mom and saying, "Mom, what's going on?" Jesus simply said, "Woman, why do you involve me?" And of course, Jesus here objects at first. My hour has not yet come. But he still performs this sign, this miracle, this sign of turning water into wine. Some people might read this to mean that Mary has some special ability to make requests of Jesus. Well, if mom says it, Jesus does it, kind of a thing. And there are groups out there that highly venerate Mary, and this is one of the reasons for it. Mary asked Jesus to do something, Jesus does it, therefore Mary has some sort of control over Jesus. I'm not really sure. But nothing in the text says Jesus did this because mom asked him to do it. There is no place in the Gospels where Jesus does something just because someone bugs him to do it. Everything Jesus does is the will of the Father. John 5:19, Jesus gave them this answer, very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing. John 6:38, for I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but the will of him who sent me. Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So if only those who do the will of the Father in heaven enter the kingdom, doesn't that tell us Jesus clearly is doing the will of the Father, since Jesus is the kingdom? Now, I don't like to make assumptions from argument or from assumptions or arguments from silence. But here in John, we only read Jesus saying, my hour has not yet come, and then the next thing is Mary tells the servants to do what Jesus says, and what Jesus tells them to do. And I think here's one of those spots we do have to make a bit of an assumption based on everything else we know about Jesus. What I really believe happened here is after Mary says, hey, they're out of wine, and says to the servants, do what my son tells you to do, I think Jesus paused and prayed and heard from his Father. And the Heavenly Father tells the Son, okay, this is something you need to do. Now's the time. Go ahead and do it. Perform this sign. Again, Jesus isn't going to do something just because someone else wants him to do it. I always think of the story of James and John asking, Jesus, can we rain fire down from heaven and destroy these Samaritans in this village because they rejected us? Please, please, please let us rain fire down from heaven. Did Jesus say, yeah, okay, that's cool? No. His response was, you guys, come on, please, stop. No, that's not what we're going to do. He isn't persuaded there. And he's not going to be persuaded to manifest wine just because mom asks him to do it. Jesus does the will of his Father. Verse 6, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Anybody do the math real quick? 6 jars, 20 to 30 gallons. How many gallons is it? 120 to 180, roughly. Am I right? Can we check the math? Do I need to take my calculator out? I did that last night. I made sure I was right. 120 to 180 gallons of wine. Sounds like a lot of wine. There is a theory here that the jars represent more than just a jar that holds water. Since they're jars used for ceremonial washing, it is suggested that this represents the end of the Old Covenant and the beginning of the New Covenant. The Old Covenant being that between God and Abraham, essentially Jewish law or the Torah, the idea of circumcision, food purity laws, sacrifices, and so on. The New Covenant being this covenant through Jesus, through his death and resurrection. But I think if this were symbolic, it would be completely lost on the people at the wedding. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, the people at the wedding, they don't know that Jesus is this new covenant yet. Remember, this is the first sign that he performs. And a lot of people probably aren't even aware of this sign, at least at first. Because the only ones, this is point 2, the only ones that know the water is now wine is coming out of these ceremonial jars is the servants. Right? They're the only ones that are pulling the water out of there, the wine, the water, wine, wherever the water actually turns to wine in that process, it doesn't tell us. It may be in the jar. It might be when they pull the water out of the jar. It might be as they're walking to the party. We don't know. But the only ones that are aware that it started as water really is Jesus, probably his mom, the few people that are there, the servants. Those are the only ones that see. And verse 11 says, and his disciples believed in him. His disciples believed in him. Not everybody at the wedding. That theory, this idea of the symbolism of Old Covenant, New Covenant, I think we might be reading a little too much into it. But if you do, that's fine. You believe that, that's fine. I really doubt Judgment Day God is going to be, hey, so what did the jars symbolize in that wedding at Cana? If you get this wrong, I can't let you into heaven. Is that going to happen? I don't think so. Let's talk about the wine now for a little bit. That's what you all wanted to hear about, right? Yeah. And I do want to preface this part by saying this. Just because the Bible talks about it does not mean God endorses it. Remember that. Just because the Bible talks about it does not mean that God endorses it. There are a lot of things that we read in the Bible that if we understand it in the proper context, we understand God is not condoning it. A really great example of this is from Psalm 137, verses 8 and 9. Psalm 137, verses 8 and 9. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. You guys heard that psalm before? Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Is that symbolic, or is the psalmist actually talking about bashing babies' heads against rocks? Not symbolic at all. The psalmist is actually saying, we will be happy when we can take your children and kill them. But is this saying that God is advocating baby murder? No, absolutely not. The psalmist, the writer of this, is angry. They are lamenting what Babylon has done to the Israelites. And in their human desire for revenge, they're calling for the Babylonian children to be killed to make the Babylonians feel what the Israelites felt. But it doesn't mean that God is advocating it. It doesn't mean that God is endorsing it. Remember that. Back here in John, talking about the wine Jesus made from water. You get an argument from some groups here. Old school Baptists will argue this. Mormons will argue this. Any alcohol is sin group will argue this. They'll argue that the wine that Jesus created was more of a grape juice. It was not alcoholic. But that argument doesn't hold up for a couple of reasons. Now, I think I've mentioned at least one of these before, but we're going to talk about it again. And the first reason we can know that it's just regular old wine is the symbolism of it. Water, still today in many places around the world, is not safe to drink. When we go to Mexico, do we drink the tap water when we go to Mexico? Don't even brush your teeth with the tap water. If you accidentally got your toothbrush in the tap water, throw it away, get rid of it. Do not let that water, when you're taking a shower, you clench your mouth shut and brush your teeth. Don't let the water get in your mouth, right? Do not consume the water because it will make you sick. It will make you very, very sick. I see some people smiling. You guys know what happens. The advantage, though, that if we're on that trip and we do drink some of that water by accident and we get sick, we can at least replenish our fluids with some Powerade, and we can drink some liquid IV, and we can replenish the fluids we're losing. But there are some places in the world where if you get sick like that, you dehydrate very quickly and you die. In the ancient world, and still some places today, water was death. But you still need to drink something. Everybody says you can't live if you don't have water, right? So you got to drink something. The fermentation process that creates wine purifies the wine. It purifies this drink, and it makes it safe. Wine was life. So when Jesus takes water and he turns it into wine, he is taking death and turning it into life. Water is death. Wine is life. Jesus takes water, turns it into wine. Jesus takes death and turns it into life. The other thing that tells us that, yes, this is just regular old wine is right here in John's Gospel. Verses 9 and 10 say this: "And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, 'Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now.'" Here the master of the banquet is talking about something people still do today. Again, I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying it happens. But if you've ever had your days where you've been out drinking, maybe one or two of you have done that. You probably started out with something that was a little fuller, a little more flavorful, a little heavier. And then as your senses dull, you go with the thinner stuff, the cheaper stuff, the stuff that doesn't taste so good. Why? Because when you get to that point, you're not going to know the difference anyway. And that's exactly what the master of the banquet is saying here. Everyone brings out the choice wine first and the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Again, I'm not saying the Bible advocates drinking to excess. I'm not suggesting we switch over to wine for communion. I'm not saying it's okay for you to drink all the Jesus miracle Jewish ceremonial jar juice wine you want to. Jesus isn't approving or encouraging that. The story here simply tells us what happened. So the next time your friend tells you that it was only grape juice, you can say, no, it was regular old wine. But it was really, really good wine. And I'm not trying to make a joke when I say that. Because I want you to think about what the master of ceremonies says here, the master of the banquet says here. You bring out the choice wine, the best wine first, then when they've had too much to drink, when their senses are dulled, you bring out the cheap stuff. Think about this, guys. They probably did serve the good stuff first. Why wouldn't they? That's always what they do. The best they could find, they served first, then they served the cheaper stuff. But what Jesus created here was so much better than the best stuff they could find. What Jesus created was better than the best wine on earth, because Jesus is better than anything on earth. Amen? The first sign. Jesus turns water into wine. It shows us who Jesus is. It tells us what Jesus can do. It shows us that Jesus is better than even the best things here on earth. The first sign, but certainly not the last. Remember, this is very early in Jesus' ministry. He only has a handful of his disciples with him, and more would start to follow later. They see this sign, and verse 11 says, his disciples believed in him. You may not be present to see that sign, Jesus turning water into wine. But you will see other signs of who Jesus is. But you likely won't see a big jar of water turn into wine. We can read about it here. We can read about it from someone who was there. The disciples believed. They believed who he was. Do you believe? Do you believe that Jesus is the Messiah? Do you believe that he is the one who is to come into the world? Jesus performed many miracles, many signs. Is that enough for you to believe that he is God? Is that enough for you to believe that he is the Savior of the world? Believe today.